In this series, lowimpact.org and the Open Credit Network talks with people working to build a mutually owned, democratic, decentralised economy that builds community and doesn't destroy nature. We want to increase collaboration to bring about system change. Find links to the sites mentioned in the videos in the description below. Join the conversation by liking, commenting and subscribing to our channel.
So today I'm sitting here with Dil Green, Tim Jenkin and Matthew Slater, who've been working on the Credit Commons, a global mutual credit network with the aim of providing an alternative to the money system. I'll be asking how they got into it and why, what's happened so far and what the plans are for the future. But first I'd like to mention that Tim, who escaped from a high security prison in South Africa during the apartheid era, is the subject of an upcoming film starring Daniel Radcliffe. That's why you're in London, isn't it, Tim?
That is correct. That's why I'm here.
And when's it coming out?
It's due out on the 6th of March, 2020, this year. It'll be available on DVD and Blu-ray and for download and all the normal channels, as well as in some movie houses.
And what's it called?
Escape from Pretoria.
Escape from Pretoria. So I want to talk about the money system and the proposed alternative. I'll interrupt with questions if the conversation gets a bit too technical for a general audience. I'll ask for a bit of clarification. So say hi, Tim.
Good day, how are you?
Say hi, Dil.
Hello, hi.
Say hi, Matthew.
Hi, Matthew.
So what's wrong with the current, anybody who feels like fielding this one, what's wrong with the current money system and why do you want to change it?
Well, the current money system, we all learn, is presented to us like a public utility, a bit like the water or electricity or the sewers, whatever you want to, whichever one of those you want to compare it to. But when you look at it in a bit more detail, it's not really a public utility. It's something that's provided to us, and we need to look at who the provider is. Most people think that the money system is a benefit given to us by our governments. If you look at the notes that we use or the coins, it generally has a picture of the king or the queen or the president or whoever is head of your country. So we all think it's something provided to us by the state as a public utility. But the more you look into it, you realize that this facility is not really a government thing. It comes from the central bank. If you look closer at the notes, I don't know if it's the case here in Britain, but certainly in South Africa, where I'm from, it says South African Reserve Bank. And if you look further, you will find that the Reserve Bank is a private organization. It's a private company with shareholders. And this is the entity that provides the money for the country. So money, in a sense, if you look at it a bit more carefully, is way more than just a utility, and it is more than just a medium of exchange and a store of value and a unit of account, as we are taught when we go to college and we read the economics books. It's way more than that. And historically, we see that, to cut a long story short, it's a control system. It's the means by which our ruling classes keep us in place. So you can go back as many years as you like to a period thousands of years ago, to the Egyptians or the Mesopotamians. Although they didn't have anything that we can recognize as money, those who controlled the means of exchange or the means of distribution controlled the society. So the peasants were required to bring in their surplus to the center, to the warehouse or the temple or the palace, from where records were kept. And then the ruling class took their cut and the remainder was redistributed to the people. So that is how they controlled the resources of the society. And later on, Decentralized systems fell away because they weren't very efficient, and various monetary forms were invented because it meant you didn't have to really keep any records anymore. But if you look at the coins of the archaeological record, you will see that they always had the head of the king on it. And why is that? And why is it that they maintained control over the money system and allowed no one else to create their own money in competition? So it's always been a monopoly in every country or every empire or every city-state that you can imagine. It was always a monopoly, and this was controlled by the emperor or the king. And why? Why could the people themselves not create their own means of exchange? And it's never been allowed. So I'm going to stop there and let someone else talk.
I think, Tim, you've given a purely political answer, but there's also the environmental argument and the economic argument. So what's wrong with the money system economically? We can say that it's really stopped functioning since the crash in about 2008, and presumably in the period before that when the bubble was blowing. And in fact, bubbles have been blown and bursting quite gently for the last several hundred years. So the whole business cycle is programmed into the money system, as well as the booms and busts. And that includes the recession or depression that we've been in since 2008. So economically, the money system isn't working either. Maybe Dil can give us the environmental argument.
So the structure of money we have at the moment is where it's always issued at debt, and therefore more has to be paid back than was issued. And that means that everyone, every normal person who either works for a month for free before they get paid their salary, which is another way of you're in debt before you get hold of money, or you borrow money from the bank, you're in debt straight away, has to pay back more than they received. And essentially, environmentally, that goes to the natural world, where digging things from the ground or sucking things out of the air has no cost to it. And so the argument goes that an ever-expanding money system requires ever-expanding extraction from the biosphere that keeps us all alive. And until sort of 50 years ago, that seemed inexhaustible and not worth paying any attention to. But we're realizing now, rather too late and with rather too little urgency, that actually we're having a significant impact on the capacity of the planet to support our civilization, and that's an urgent problem.
And more environmental economists, ecological economists, are saying that we have to change the money system in order to stop growth at 2-3% per year.
GDP growth for sure is dangerous. I would add something else as well. I would add a social angle. In order for these private central banks and in fact the private multinational banks, who are actually creating most of the money these days since the liberalization of credit laws around the world in the 70s and the 80s, it's their business model to charge you money for the money that they create. So if there was plenty of money, if there was enough money, they wouldn't be able to charge very much money for money. So it's in their interest to keep money scarce and therefore expensive. And what that means is that the 99% experience constant scarcity of money. It's a question I like to ask audiences. I like to ask people, can they think of any aspect of their lives whatsoever that have not been deeply affected by scarcity of money? And, you know, people, I'm very pleased to say, do raise their hands and have things that they can point to. But even things like, well, loving my child hasn't been affected by scarcity of money. I love my child, whatever. But it's very easy to say, but were you able to be with them as often as you wished? Or did you have to go out and do work that you didn't particularly fancy doing in order to be confident that you could feed them and keep them warm or fed or clothed? And so scarcity of money has, as well as the political structure of power, it also brings everybody up in a society where cruelty is sort of baked in. And that does a lot of psychological damage to people and makes it very hard for people to trust each other and to work together, because everybody's frightened all the time, and that's extremely damaging.
So the current system causes problems for democracy, problems for nature, plus problems with scarcity and therefore poverty. And I know that your preferred alternative is the credit commons. So what is the credit commons and how did you get into it?
Can I say, I think that before we talk about the credit commons, we should reel back into the core concept of mutual credit, which is how a society, any human scale society, can run a system whereby it creates its own money supply that enables the people within that society to regulate exchange of value and to send messages to each other about what is important and what is not important. And that doesn't have to be. So the credit commons is an approach to a global economic alternative, but it's based in this idea of mutual credit, which is much more local, which suggests that in any sufficiently large community where there's economic activity going on, we're not talking about families or sort of a choir or something like that. It's perfectly possible, particularly given modern technology, for people to just agree to trust each other for a certain amount of credit and to keep accounts of that credit in an agreed numeric unit. They don't need any physical tokens to pass around. And the guarantor of that money isn't any central body. It's the society managing itself, managing the rules around who can access credit and how that credit should be managed democratically. And there's simply no need in a well-run instance of that agreement for there to be a central authority. In fact, central authorities tend to be a common cause of failure of such networks.
So insofar as a community or a society is trading amongst itself, they can create their own money to do so. But if you want to trade outside the society,
Yeah.
you need a money that is valuable outside the society. And so most of the time now, most of the societies in England, however much you try to separate them off, they're still using money from outside. And that means they have to get the money before they can spend it. It usually means they have to borrow the money. And it means that that act of borrowing is a source of extraction of wealth through interest from that community or society.
Yes, I think for us, we need to be clear that the main concept here is about exchange. It's the highest concept. Most people think the higher concept is money itself. It's like God. It's the highest concept and there's nothing beyond it. In fact, exchange is one of the properties of life or the universe. Everything depends on everything else. And there's natural exchange taking place between animals and organisms and bacteria and everything that's living on the earth. But human exchange is slightly different because, well, like anything else, we want to improve it or facilitate it. So if we want to walk somewhere, we can walk like animals, but for us, that's not good enough. We first used a mule to carry us, and then we developed some other means of transport like cars and trains and airplanes. And it's exactly the same with exchange. Traditional natural forms of exchange are very slow, and you have no control over it. So we historically have developed methods of exchange, and money is simply one of them. It's not like the concept, the only way we can exchange. Everything in life has to be monetized. There are many, 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 if you look through history, there are many ways that people have found to exchange things, and mutual credit is another one. It works quite similarly to money, but it doesn't require any tokens. And in fact, the money system today is, although we imagine there are tokens there, it's really pretty much the same thing. It's just an accounting system where someone receives something and once someone gives something. And one account goes up and the other one goes down. And so you ask, why is there any need for tokens? Because they're completely redundant. But no bank is going to tell you that, because then they'll be out of business. They need to lend us these tokens at interest, and that's how they exist. So they've hijacked a natural exchange system that we ourselves can control. They've taken it away from us and charged us to use it, and enslaved humanity at the same time. So we're all spending our entire life chasing after this thing, and it shapes our society. So we're on this juggernaut that's heading to the cliff, and we can't really do anything about it. A lot of people take the political approach and say, oh, we need to change the money system, we need to replace capitalism with socialism or communism or some other ism. Yet the money system, as we understand it, remains in place. So nothing ever changes because someone is still controlling the system. It's a monopoly system, exchange system. We need to get rid of that. Not even get rid of it, we just need to develop an alternative. And that's really what the Credit Commons is about. It's providing an alternative that bypasses all this monetary nonsense. And we can simply exchange things without the tokens. We just keep records, and we can use other methods as well. We don't want to replace one monopoly system with another. And it's a very simple system to use. And our object is to get people to use it and to realize that there is an alternative to money. It's not just barter. People think if you don't have money, well, what are you going to do? You're going to die, or you're going to have to barter things. There's a multitude of ways that you can facilitate exchange.
And there are successful examples of mutual credit out there, aren't there? It's not just pie in the sky.
There's a whole range of viable alternatives out there from community groups, and I think we worked out the other day that using sort of software that's quite often very simple, there's upwards of 1,000 groups around the world of between 25 and a few hundred people doing mutual exchange at a community level. And then there's also hundreds of business schemes which are doing mutual exchange at a fairly sort of capitalistic basis, but they are still finding that the creation of credit between members of communities of trust is advantageous to their efforts. So yeah, there's a wide range of possibilities.
They're not all economic as well. A lot of the communities that Tim and I support with our software are more interested in building the community and building relationships and building trust through exchange than they are in becoming wealthy in any monetary or material sense. But that doesn't mean the mechanism can't be used for that.
So tell me about the Credit Commons then and how it came about.
Well, the trouble with money is that it doesn't actually care if exchange takes place. It can help individual people with exchange because they will go out and earn the money and then they'll spend it, and that's an exchange. But if you look at the whole society, the exchange isn't taking place, maybe because people will save the money and so they'll freeze an exchange halfway through, or maybe because they'll spend the money outside that society. And so the exchange isn't happening within the society. And normal money doesn't care about that at all. But in mutual credit, it matters very much that you complete the exchange, and it allows everyone to complete the exchange, because the one who issues the money in the first place and spends it is also the one who earns it back and evaporates it. So you issue credit, and then it circulates around, and when it comes back to you, it just disappears. And in that time, it was money. But it ensures that the exchange is complete by coming back to the issuer within the community. And so mutual credit is accounting for that. It's how far away is each person from actually completing the exchange and getting their balance back to zero.
So it's just a means of exchange, not a thing that you can hold in your hand and accumulate.
Well, I call it accounting for exchange. Everybody is either up or down in the exchange at any one time, and the amount by which everyone is up is equal to the amount by which everyone is down. And that means all the balances in the accounting system add up to zero, meaning that if you just clear them all out, then the exchange will be complete.
A really easy way to think about that is actually people operate this system all over, certainly the Anglo-Saxon world, buying rounds in the pub. Among a group of friends, everyone roughly knows who's, a little bit down and whose turn it is to pay for everyone else's drinks. Because the accounting system there is usually pints, everyone, it's quite easy to measure up and down. But because it's a very loose accounting system and it's just in people's memories, no one would trust it for significant levels of exchange over several years for larger amounts. But just by beginning to keep record of how many pints X is up and how many pints X is down, no one's piling up piles of pints in their back garden saying, aha, I'm rich. But the society can actually look and say, oh, look, so-and-so's so many pints down. It'd be good if we asked them to buy a couple of rounds the next time we're in the pub. And that gives everybody trust. So if someone disappears for a year, you're not going to forget how many pints they owed you when they come back because it's written down. So that's this sort of accounting for exchange. And it's really just enabling a wider spread of trust over a longer period of time in a larger group of people. But what you asked was why the credit commons came into existence.
Yeah, the credit commons as distinct from the concept of mutual credit.
So for me, it's all about the fact that mutual credit works on the basis of mostly trust between people. And so if a mutual credit network gets too large, then trust begins to be harder to develop. If there are 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 people in a network, then actually you don't know very many of them at all. So your level of trust in the future viability of this accounting system, is that person actually going to be asked to buy their number of pints? Well, they might be cheats, and you've no way of knowing because there's 10,000 people in the scheme. So there's a natural scale for mutual credit systems. And the problem with that in a complex economy is that most small groups of businesses or small groups of people produce a tiny subset of the goods and services that we've all come to depend on. And so there's always been a question of how you can have a completely local economy and still be able to buy light bulbs and clean water that's done in a water processing plant 50 miles away. And the credit commons is this wonderful invention by these two that makes it possible for money creation to stay local and on the basis of trust, but that exchange can happen across networks.
So Tim, how did it start?
Well, for us, it started really as a single Let's group way back in 2002.
Let's group, you better...
Let's is really what we've been describing, but traditionally Let's was a community where people agreed to really advertise what they can do and what they have to provide others, and they would create, say, a paper directory and distribute this between the participating members. And then they would, instead of having a circulating currency, they would give the currency a name, and it was based on the local national currency, like the pound or the dollar or whatever, and they would simply write out checks to each other. So in other words, they were buying and selling with each other in the national currency, but there was no need for the actual money. So they would just say, I'm selling you that computer, and if it was money, I'd charge you £100 for it. And they would write out a check for that amount and give it to an administrator who would then enter it into a spreadsheet and keep a ledger of debits and credits. So the provider would be credited, get some points for it, and the buyer would be debited, get some negative points for it, and the two would balance out to zero.
And this was back in the days before computers.
Back in the day before computers, it developed in the 1980s and before the internet era. And then I think the community exchange system was the first to develop a kind of internet version of this, where the poor administrator didn't have to do all the work. So the members themselves could advertise on the website what they could provide, and others could advertise what they required, and they could enter their own transactions. So it wasn't all on the back of the administrator. So this made it much more viable, because with a paper system, you're stuck with, once you reach 200, 300 members, it just becomes too much of a burden for one administrator to be entering all these trades manually, and it often resulted in burnout and the collapse of these groups. So here, once the internet was there and we could program all this and have databases, then all those manual tasks fell away and people could manage their own accounts, and it was a kind of self-running system. And everyone could look at the balances of everyone else, and it was a fantastic way to do less. And the group started to grow and expand and get beyond the limits of anything seen before. But then the next stage was, how do these separate groups trade with each other? Or are they just going to remain little separate communities forever and not be able to participate in a bigger, grander scheme? So we developed a kind of protocol where groups could begin to trade with each other. So someone in another part of the country could trade. It's a bit of a difficult mechanism to explain how it happens, but it allowed groups now to sort of operate at a second level, keeping balances between themselves. And then later this expanded to a global network. And then even beyond that, where the Credit Commons comes in, is that separate networks doing similar things could now begin to collaborate and cooperate and trade with each other. So you now have virtually, of course not on the same scale, but something like the SWIFT system where banks all over the world can trade and so on. So we've kind of created a mini version of that. And so we can link together all these minute little communities and create this huge entity that is potentially as effective as the global monetary system. Obviously, we don't have the scale and we don't have the resources and so on, but the mechanism is there.
What's been built so far? Where have you got to?
We've got a prototype of the Credit Commons software. The Credit Commons itself is a protocol, which means it's a sort of language for different softwares to talk to each other. In fact, for different ledgers to talk to each other. So I built a prototype that implements the protocol. And so now we've proved that it's possible to send a transaction across several ledgers. So the Credit Commons, when it grows, it becomes a sort of tree structure. And if you want to send a transaction far away, It'll go from the twigs to the branches to the trunk and back down another branch. And each one of those is a ledger. So one transaction might appear on many, many ledgers in the Credit Commons, and we've got that working, but we haven't installed it on our own systems yet.
So it works, so you need member networks to join.
We've got our own member networks, but migrating is quite a big job.
So I'm just trying to get a picture of where you are now and what the plans are for the future.
It's worth saying, I think, for people listening to this, and I'm sure you'll put a link, that the Credit Commons white paper is quite a short read, and it's quite careful and definitive, and it sets out in more technical detail than we can talking here how all that stuff works. So that's really worth people going and having a look at. And I'm sure there'll also be a link to the software repository, and if people, more technical people, are welcome to go and have a look at that. But I think where we're at the moment really is still looking for and talking amongst ourselves as to the best niche in which people will find it valuable to collaborate across groups. The community style groups tend to be, as Matthew said, they're as much about strengthening the bonds of local community as they are about deep value production. They're quite often people doing things in their spare time, people swapping spare fruit, produce, people sharing their tools and local capacities. And those things, by definition, are very often satisfiable within your local community and don't travel well across boundaries. So the business to business networks are probably going to be the more significant early adopters of such longer distance trade. So for instance, there's a very successful network in Sardinia, Sardex. It's got over 4,000 members, I believe, in Sardinia. And Dave, you and I are members of a UK initiative called the Open Credit Network, which is also a non-profit taking, as Sardex is, but business to business network.
Yeah,
and
there'll be links to all this in the description below.
It's very easy to imagine that some, let's say, food wholesaler in Britain might want to access good quality olive oil from Sardinia, because we don't grow olives in Britain, and that people in Sardinia might well want to have some, I don't know, UK craft ale, let's say. If there's an Irish pub in Sardinia, there's Irish pubs all over the world, they need British style beers to sell. So there's, potential business to business trade across.
The conversation keeps coming back to beer for some reason, but so what happens next? Ideally, what happens next?
We're going to raise a lot of money. We're going to hire some software developers. We're going to make a massive advertising campaign. We're going to bring all the existing local communities and local business networks into the system, because we're going to publish the protocol, and they'll just add it to their software, and they'll find that they're able to pay each other amongst themselves for free, or for a tiny fee to pay anybody else in the UK, or for a slightly larger fee to pay anybody else in Europe. And we'll start to see an economy outside of the economy, a real alternative,
Parallel,
where you can draw a line between one economy and the other, because they're using very different money.
Tim, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, yeah, I just support what Matthew is saying. We're not fighting the other economy or the other monetary system or exchange system. We're trying to just quietly create an alternative. I think what is attractive about what we're doing is that, you know, it's not based on coercion like the conventional money system is. You know, it's what backs our governments. We don't tax people, so people begin to feel that this is their monetary system or their exchange system. It's not someone else's, and it's a way of building our communities, and it brings back that monetary power that we all recognize is sort of the primary power that controls us, that is controlling the whole trajectory of where our society is going.
It's also a form of action and of activism.
It
doesn't involve petitioning and campaigning.
That is correct.
And begging and hoping. It involves changing your economic behavior, what you produce, because you have to produce something if you're going to consume something, and you have to produce it for the people you're consuming from. And so it helps to focus the mind as well.
A really key aspect of mutual credit is that it tends to produce a sufficient money supply, not too much money, but also not enough. And when there's a sufficient money supply and people get used to feeling that money isn't something that is perpetually scarce, then they don't indulge so much in sort of hoarding, and they don't feel as frightened all the time, so they don't need to sort of go out and do sort of what's it called, therapeutic shopping or whatever, retail therapy. And that's not just a pious hope, that is the experience in the many hundreds of communities that Let schemes support. People are more interested in community and sufficiency and less interested in being avid consumers. And so this is sort of, I'd hesitate to say it's a sort of solidly proven point, but it's a very easily observable phenomenon in those networks. And so it's a real move against the consumerism, which is at the root of climate disaster.
Also, it feels different to use. Lots of experiments have been done with money and psychology, and that green stuff does something bad to our psychologies. But mutual credit is a different kind of money, and it makes people feel good to use it very often.
Yes. Just to clarify, it's not possible to hoard the means of exchange in the mutual credit system.
Well, like we talked about earlier, the entire system always has to add up to zero, because every credit has an equal and opposite debit. So the object of users of mutual credit is not to accumulate them, because that doesn't make sense, because it's really just a record of what you've done and received. So your object over the long term is really to keep your personal balance around zero as well. Sometimes you're above, sometimes you're down below. So we operate within a band. So there's a ceiling and there's a floor.
There's a limit to how far you can go.
Yeah, in the money system, there's no roof, there's no ceiling. There's like, you're encouraged to, the sky is the limit. And the guy who's the richest, you know, there's always competing. Who's the richest man in the world? He's got $75 trillion. We don't do that sort of thing. So it's there's a limit. When you reach the upper limit, the ceiling, it's like you're just accumulating numbers, or just, and what does it mean? It means that you're not giving others the opportunity of providing stuff so that they can earn credits. And the same, when you reach the floor, it means that you're just taking and not giving. So the object is always to keep that balance between giving and receiving.
But more than that, Tim, there's no interest in the system.
There's no interest.
So there isn't that incentive to save, because you can't make money from money.
Exactly.
You can't make money from speculation either, because the exchange rates are stable.
because every member of a network essentially creates their own money when they spend on the basis of their own membership of the network and trust of other members that they're good for that credit. There's no point hoarding the money thinking, as you do in a scarce system, if you manage to accumulate $1 trillion, you know you can boss around a lot of people who haven't got enough money because it's an inherently scarce money system. But if you try and do that in a let scheme, people just say, okay, well, I'll do a bit more work and I'll produce some more money. You know, what have you got that I haven't got? Everyone can spend. So there's simply no inbuilt incentive to create large piles of cash. And in fact, people quite quickly realize, as Tim says, that the safest place to be in a mutual credit system is at or around zero, because that means that if anything happens to the economy, you haven't got a large pile of useless units. You've actually, you could walk away because you're around zero. Nobody owes you anything. You don't owe anybody anything. You can start something new and you're good to go.
So it's only possible to earn credit by doing something useful.
Well, that's the idea, is that you can't accumulate points or systems or money or whatever by doing nothing, as the current system works, through interest or speculation or dividend. I mean, yeah, all kinds of incredible schemes that have been developed to divert the money into accounts without. So there's a whole class of people who don't really produce anything valuable for the rest of society, and they manipulate and control the rest of us who do the production of things. So this is, if you don't do anything, you don't get any points, and if you take from the community, you'll eventually reach a point where no one trusts you because you're just a taker, a free rider. And the idea of keeping these groups as small as possible is that people get to know each other. So you know who the bad guys are, and it's friendly. And we've experienced this. It's not just a pie in the sky, some sort of theoretical thing. We've seen it for years and years. And, you know, we have regular markets and so on, and these are very friendly enterprises. It creates a completely different spirit, because we're not all just chasing after this medium that is so scarce and competing with each other and fighting over a small amount of it. There's no limit. We just don't need to steal. We don't need to fight. There's no way of stealing it because it doesn't exist.
Plus, I guess if the wider economy crashes, it would be very beneficial to be involved in a mutual credit scheme.
For sure, because of that basic engine of money production is that your community trusts that you will do productive work in the future. And the classic thing that has everybody scratching their head in 2009 is, well, this car factory is still here, still with plenty of people who want to work and make cars. It's got lots of steel, it's got lots of car tires, but suddenly it's stopped producing cars. What's the reason for that? People still want cars. You know, cars are maybe not the favorite example. I should have said beer, of course.
Of course.
And the reason is that suddenly all the credit has dried up because the banks don't trust each other. So all the people in the world who need stuff, who want to work, who have the places to work round the corner from them, are suddenly told you're not needed anymore, your productivity is not needed anymore. But at the same time, they can't get hold of the stuff. So the whole economy grinds to a halt because the banks don't trust each other. But in mutual credit networks, people would say, well, you're still you can still fit my window tomorrow, you can still make my beer.
Nothing's changed.
I still want beer. Let's carry on.
Mm-hmm. But it all sounds great. So what are the main barriers to the growth of this new kind of economy?
Well, there's the ideological thing, of course, which is that we've all grown up with this idea of money, and it's deeply implanted in our psyches, and this idea that if you don't have money, then you're finished. You know, you're basically dead. If you don't have money or a source of money, then you are so-called unemployed, and you can't do anything. You can't access the resources of the society, mainly food and accommodation and all the basics. So this seems to be, I mean, it's a way around that idea, although it's still very small, and most of the major things are not available. We're not selling houses and cars yet, and you can't get petrol and you can't buy air tickets, but everything has to grow. Everything is born and then it grows, and that's what we're hoping, is that more and more people will understand that it's about exchange and that you don't need money to exchange. And simply by implementing these things and getting more and more people to use them and to experience the friendliness and the fact that this builds community as opposed to money, which tends to destroy community, it's a better place. And ultimately, we're hoping that one day all these things will be available. It's not going to be an easy ride. You know, one day the powers that be will notice that we're undermining their profitability and their ability to lend money, because here's a challenge, and they've always had this monopoly backed by government legal tender laws, and suddenly along comes this thing which does what they do, but without all this nonsense. And we don't know what will happen. Presumably they'll get their mates in the government to legislate against us, but in a sense it's almost something that you can't stop, because how do you stop people exchanging something that's outside of the system? It is not dependent on any of their mechanisms. And people have been doing it for thousands and thousands of years. And they have tried to monetize everything that we've always done naturally, and try to squeeze out the natural exchange and to monetize everything, because they're always seeking for new places to invest money. And we need to push back against that and create some kind of situation that's not hijackable, and that is not, they can't really terminate it, because you can't stop people exchanging things with each other. And mutual credit itself is also just one way of doing it. There are many other ways of facilitating exchange. We really need to introduce this idea that there's not only one way of doing it. It's not the monetary way. There's many different ways. Mutual credit sort of does what money does, but it doesn't control us. So it's our money, it's not their money.
It's the social network effect. Everybody's on Facebook. Lots of people are trying to build a better social network, but you can't get people to move out of Facebook because all their connections are in Facebook. And we know from many years of playing with monetary systems that the same thing is going on. It's much more quick and easy and convenient to use your national currency, which is in your wallet, in your cards, in the bank, everybody accepts it, than it is to switch over to another marketplace to see if you can meet your needs in that small marketplace first.
So the biggest barrier is inertia.
I think there's a lot of mental barriers and changing of habits. But the best things that have happened in a lot of those lets and time banking systems are when people make it the aim of their life to live within that system. And one person in a little group like a Let's can really animate it if they're really determined. And so that's what I'm trying to do with my life now, to live as much as possible of the really local economy by giving and taking from people around me.
So yeah, barriers to entry. I think that what Tim referred to, the sort of psychological idea, I think for many people the laws of money feel more real than the laws of physics. To them, it's, well, gravity could change a bit and that might be fine, but if the money system stopped working, what would we do? The fact is that the money system has been changed under our feet every 30 or 40 years since it was invented. I mean, the rules of money now would be unrecognizable to an 18th, century businessman. They would be shocked and horrified by all sorts of things that are common practice now. So for me, the way to conquer that is actually sort of relating to what Matthew said about social networks, is to sort of step away from this idea of, oh, aren't we clever? We've invented a better sort of money. Come and talk to us about money and how your relationship with money could be better. And actually do what Facebook are proposing to do, which is to have a social network where trade is a first-class tool of that social network. But to have that trade more beneficial than scarce currency controlled by somebody else. And that idea of networks of groups, a social network of groups that federate together in the same way as an economy of groups that federate together, is something that I'm actively pursuing. And I'm pretty hopeful that that will be a way to get people using this form of exchange without really noticing, because if it works for them and they're swapping numbers backwards and forwards on a screen, they're absolutely used to swapping numbers backwards and forwards on a screen. That's what PayPal does. If they can swap numbers backwards and forwards on a scheme within a social network where they can find people to swap things with, and there always seems to be enough of that stuff, and you can get free credit to some limit based on how much you've traded before, then I think people will just vote with their feet and they'll say, well, this works. I'm here, I'll do it. There is, for me, a great urgency to having a viable system that does that, because Facebook are certainly trying with Libra, and it's pretty obvious that another big social network that's growing incredibly fast called Telegram has got the same plans. And so I think, and there's also the example of Tencent in China, which is already a 1 point something billion user social network, which is a payment network as well. And so these things have huge sort of juggernaut-like power once they get large. And if it's Facebook or Telegram that offer this system, then it will be much harder for a small competitor to, even if it's offering a better service, to come into the network.
And that will be the same old problem, concentrated wealth and power in Facebook rather than the banks. Exactly.
It'll be much more frightening because Facebook have got much murkier regulation, much weaker regulation. Banks have been heavily regulated because it's so political, because it's to do with power. Facebook may well not get to market because they've reckoned without how resistant to change the existing power structures will be. But Telegram are coming up on the rails, I think, and nobody really sees them coming, and they're sort of blockchain-y, so they sort of can step outside regulation, and it'll be interesting to see what they come up with. But they're pretty smart and they're very well funded.
So if people are up for helping to build this alternative, how can they get involved? What should they do?
If they're in the UK and they've got any sort of business activity, they can join the Open Credit Network, and that will be rolling out local clubs as sort of subsets of the UK-wide network in the next year. If people watching this have got technical capacities or social media capacity, whatever, then they can get in touch with the Credit Commons project and join a more global, sort of longer term project that's less directly about participating. If they're in neither of those situations, then they can get hold of one of various sets of software that are available for free on the internet and set up their own local trading group. And again, you should have a load of links at the bottom of this that help with that.
You don't even need to set up your own trading group. We're much less concerned at this stage about people creating accounting systems than we are about changing the culture so that everyone who wants to participate should be thinking about the way they consume and produce and who they do it for. And it needs to be done on a much more local basis. And so the credit commons and all the local currencies are there to support those real activities about producing and consuming on a local basis. The money system, the accounting doesn't come first. It's there to make it work better, but only if it's working first.
Yeah, it's important to understand that these communities or groups are real people in real communities. They're not just sort of imaginary Facebook groups or WhatsApp groups that just exist and can disappear. So anyone can start up a community by signing up. You could sign up to Community Forge and you'd get a new instance of the software, and then you're started and you can use the software for your community. And it's the same with the community exchange system. You simply fill in a form, and within a very short time you've got a new one. It's a community and it's listed. But those are nothing. They just, the software is just the tool. It's just a tool, and it's not the community. And the community won't form itself out of creating an instance on a database. It has to start with the real community. You usually need a group of keen people who want to drive this thing through, and they need to hold community meetings or advertise in the community that you want to start a group like this, or maybe there's an existing some kind of barter network in a community. You find these very often in sort of farming communities and so on. And they can avail themselves of the tools that we're providing. But we want to go much further than just providing a set of tools. We want to provide mechanisms to link all these communities into bigger bodies and to draw in other entities. There's hundreds of time banks all around the world. They're not sort of mutual credit in the sense that we've been talking about, but it's more or less the same thing. It's really just recording hours that people give and receive. So their accounting systems are the same. And these need to be brought into the network. So really it's whatever is alternative to the conventional monetary system, we need to bring these in and network them and federate them and get everyone excited about and to understand all the alternatives and not to be competing amongst ourselves. So these are all different methods that are in the box and you can use them all. And that's really the only way to grow it, to concentrate on growing in your community using these tools. And that's it.
Okay, so thank you all very, very much. And Tim, can't wait to see the film. And we're going to be following what you're all up to very closely in the future. Thank you all very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.